Okay, this is HL lesson number 6, reproduction in plants. So this is subtopic 9.4, and we're going to do this entire subtopic in one video, but normally I do it over 2 lessons because the lab component to this subtopic, and quite a few drawings to do as well. So here's our list from the IBO. Success in plant reproduction depends on pollination, fertilization, and seed dispersal. Most flowering plants use mutualistic relationships with pollinators in sexual reproduction. Flowering involves a change in gene expression in the shoot apex, and about switch of flowering plants response to light, length of light and dark periods, and applications are how we can induce short day plants to flower out of season, and skills are drawing both internal structures of seeds and half views of animal pollinated flowers. So practice both of those in today's lesson and see some examples. And our skill is design of experiments to test hypotheses about factors affecting germination. Now, hopefully you can be able to actually do some experiments, but if not, you'll at least be able to plan experiments correctly with the right variables. Here's our targets. I can analyze the evolution of flowering plants and how their structures support reproduction, and I can clearly communicate my methodology to test a factor affecting seed germination. Okay, so let's start by talking about angiosperms. This connects back to topic 5. Angiosperms are a group of plants that have flowers, and they're very, very diverse, and the flowers and their shapes and structures are a really important factor that has caused the success of this phylum. It's one of the most well-known and successful of the 4 plant phyla. When we do classify angiosperms, oftentimes you break them down to 2 types, monocots and dicots. Now those terms used to be required in IB biology but are no longer required, but they're still very useful when you're studying, because a lot of the things we talked about earlier with xylem and phloem in 9.1 and 9.2, the patterns of root and shoot structures vary between monocots and dicots. So this can be a helpful thing to know. Okay, this is based on morphology, the appearance, but it's a little bit dated. We still use it because it's still very useful. And we're going to look at some examples next. So take a look at both the structure of the flowers and the vascular system, the 2 things that are topics that are important for IB biology. Okay, so here we go with monocots and dicots. So pause the video and just take a minute and look at this diagram yourself and really look at the differences between them. Focus in particular on vascular system and flowers. So hopefully you've had a look yourself. You should have noticed here is that the definition is from the seed. So in the seed we have 1 cotyledon or 1 seed leaf in monocots and 2 in dicots. That's what defines them. And the vascular bundles are going to be arranged, and oftentimes in a complex arrangement, in monocots, in a ring, oftentimes in dicots, in the stem. And then we have the flower parts are multiples of 3 in monocots, multiples of 4 or 5 in dicots. Now those ideas are not ones that you need to memorize. You need to memorize, be able to divide out the xylem and phloem in both monocots and dicots for topic 9.1 and 9.2. But for this topic, you don't need to memorize the number of petals. It's just a helpful thing when you're talking about plants, especially flowering plants. If you pursue biology further, you will definitely come upon these terms, and you can use them in the IB exam, but they are not required terms to use. Oftentimes they are found in the mark scheme, though. Okay, let's talk about flowers. So, some plants have just male flowers and female flowers. Some plants, however, are hermaphrodites, which means they have both male and female parts on a single flower. So first, take a minute and talk to your desk partner about what the purpose of a flower may be. Why have plants evolved flowers? Well, the number one purpose of flower is reproduction. Right? It's to encourage sexual reproduction, specifically through the use of pollinators. Flowers encourage pollinators to come to the plant and carry pollen from one flower to the next. That allows for sexual reproduction. If you look at this plant, can you use your logic and your knowledge from your reading to figure out what are the male and female parts of this particular flower? Take a minute, pause the video, try it for yourself. So we look up here, the stamen and all the parts that are attached to it are the male parts of the flower. Okay, so the anther is where you have the pollen, and pollen is basically equivalent to flower sperm, and the filament holds it up. That together makes the stamen. And the carpel, as well as the ovary, which should have been your big clue, the style and the stigma, those are the female parts of the flower. And that's where we want the pollen to land on the stigma to then pollinate the flower. Okay, again, you can see here, here's the female part kind of zoomed in, and here's the male part. Okay, you definitely need to memorize these kinds of diagrams of flower parts. And this is a generalized flower. Lilies are a great one. You will probably dissect a lily or another flower with very clear and obvious stamen and carpels because it's very clear and easy to see. Now, what are the pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages of being a hermaphrodite flower? Take a minute to think about this in terms of evolution, in terms of diversity, and talk to your desk partner about it. Okay, so hopefully you have some ideas. Some important things to think about for that are advantages, are that if for some reason you don't get sexual reproduction by another flower from a pollinator, you still have a chance of just self-pollination, which is not ideal, excuse me, as far as genetic variation goes, but you're going to be able to reproduce regardless. So it's better to reproduce with self than not reproduce at all. And at disadvantages, you're putting a lot of energy into making both male and female parts. And self-pollination happens too early can cause reduced variation. So we wanted to have the option for self-pollination, but only if it's absolutely required. Ideally, we don't need to go there. Okay, let's talk about pollination. So the first step of reproduction in plants is pollination. Okay? And that's the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma, not necessarily of different flowers, ideally of different flowers, but not necessarily. Okay, and what allows it to happen most effectively are pollinators. So pollinators are organisms that are going to transfer pollen from one individual to the next, and this is a very strong mutualistic relationship. Both individuals benefit from this relationship, and it exhibits very clear coevolution. The way in which flowers attract pollinators is based on what the pollinators desire, and they evolve very close together. For example, this is the Rafflesia flower. It's found in Indonesia and parts of Malaysia and Borneo, and people will hike forever to try and see one. They're huge. You can tell the scale of picture. It emits the odor of rotting meat. That's the smell of its flower, and its pollinators are a species of fly. So take a minute and talk to your partner. Why do you think it smells like meat and it has a meat coloration? Well, flies are going to be attracted to rotting meat to put eggs in, so you want to attract a pollinator, and only your pollinator, because you can attract only one pollinator. There's a much higher chance it's going to transfer pollen specifically to another flower of the same species, which we need to do to have reproduction. So it's going to be meat-like in scent and coloring to attract pollinators who are attracted to meat. Now, here's another question for you. That's a lot of energy to make a customized flower with a smell and color to attract a pollinator. That's a lot of energy for the plant to spend. Why is it worth that energy instead of just relying on things like wind pollination? So conifers, cone-bearing trees like pine trees, they rely on wind pollination. But so many flowering plants have developed and evolved these flowers to help them reproduce. So why is it worth it to them? Take a minute and talk to your partner about that. Well, hopefully you got the idea that the increased variation from sexual reproduction is so valuable in terms of adaptation and evolution that it's going to allow to make this energy cost worth it over time. And the plants that had better flowers to attract pollinators were much more successful than those that didn't. Okay, here's a nice little diagram showing you pollination process to help visualize it better. Now every flower has a different shape, and you can see here we have pollen grains, which are the male reproductive gametes of flowers. And the insect is going to go into pollinator. Could be an insect, could be something else. I'm going to go into the flower, and when it's going to the flower, it's going to try and get nectar. Okay, from something below. And the way it has to get the nectar will force it to kind of pass by all the stamens and then get covered in pollen. When it goes to the next flower, the shoot of the flower causes it to then bump its body against the ovules and against the stigma to then cause the pollen to go onto the stigma and then pollinate the flower. This is the ideal situation. It's the same. The flower shape is designed with the pollinator in mind to cause it to pass the pollen on its body and the next individual through reproduction. Okay, so this pollination process here, which one is which? One of these is self-pollination, one of these is cross-pollination. So take a minute and figure out which one is which. So the first one here is self-pollination, and the next one is called cross-pollination. Those are good terms to know. Okay, and advantages, disadvantages of each are what? Take a minute, talk to your partner, try and make a list of at least 2 or 3. So self-pollination, type 1 here, within the same individual flower, and is transferred to the stigma of the same flower, from pollen to the anthers to the stigma. Now this has advantages, and that's guaranteed reproduction. Disadvantages, you're going to have much less genetic variation. Type 2 of self-pollination is when you have different flowers of the same plant. So it's still the same individual genetically, but we're getting a little bit further pollination. Ideally, we get cross-pollination of flowers from different plants. Now, to connect this to our understanding of genetics, and we talk about breeding of plant species, you need to understand the idea that botanists are able to control pollination through actually doing pollination themselves, acting as a pollinator. So here's what that process looks like. So we have here a hermaphrodite flower. We have the female stigma and the male stamen. And what an individual would do is if they wanted to transfer pollen, they would use a paintbrush to pick up the pollen from the anthers and then paint it onto the stigma. And before they paint it onto the stigma, they're going to remove the anthers of the flower they want to be the female flower. And this way, only there's no chance that those pollen grains are going to pollinate this flower. Instead, we're going to get cross-pollination. So if you're trying to breed a certain species of plant and you want a certain trait in it, this is one way to do so, is remove the possibility of self-pollination and cross-pollinate very deliberately the which two individuals you want to cross to get a certain looking flower, certain trait. There's a geneticist that very famously did this with pea plants. Does anybody know who it is? That would be Gregor Mendel, who we'll be talking about for inheritance of traits. He did this with thousands of pea plants to understand how the traits are passed on. Okay, we're going to talk more about pollinators here. So you can see here some of the different pollinators and their flowers they pollinate. So birds are oftentimes pollinators, and you can see how the shape of the beak is designed to allow for cross-pollination. So we have the twee as bird here, same bird both times, and two slightly different flowers is pollinating. But notice the pollen hits the top of its head here, just at this point, and then further out for the other flower. So it goes between flower to flower. It's not going to cross-pollinate the wrong species. It'll just carry the pollen from parts of its head and pass to the next flower it gets to. And of course, have insects. Offers a nectary, a place that contains nectar inside the flower that the insect is going to try to get to. That's their reward for pollination. Or the bird, here's its tongue trying to get to the nectar at the bottom, or its beak in this case. And then as it's going there, it's going to get covered in pollen. In this case, you can see the anthers poking up towards the belly of the bee, and that'll get covered in pollen, and then will transfer to the next flower it goes to. We also have bats. This is an agave flower. It's a kind of cactus, and they have so many anthers. It's crazy. So much pollen. It's their whole face and covered in pollen to get at the nectar at the base. And here's the female part of the flower here. Okay, so your skill is to draw the half view of animal pollinated flowers. So here's an example of the bat, again, its face covered in pollen, going into an agave flower. And I want you to try drawing, these are trumpet honeysuckle flowers, and they're pollinated by hummingbirds. So we want to draw as a half view where you kind of cut the flower in half so you can see bird's mouth and beak inside, and you can see all the flower parts inside as well. So pause the video for a good long pause here, and draw the half pollinative diagram. You have to be able to draw this from memory. So take a few minutes, at least 5 minutes, and draw. It's not about your artistic skills, it's about being able to communicate the pollination process that's happening. Okay, so hopefully you have made your drawing. I want to take a minute here and talk about the connection here between flowers that are pollinated by bats, like the agave flowers. They're often open at nighttime instead of the day, and they're white in color. Why do you think that is? What's the coevolutionary connection there? Well, hopefully you got the idea that at nighttime, bats don't see things. They're using sonar to move around. And so the color of the flowers does not matter to the bats. They can't see the flowers. They can just sense them by their shape as sound waves bounce off of them. So it's not important their color, so the plant's not going to waste energy making pigments it doesn't need. And then at nighttime, of course, is when bats are active. So what's pollen going to be active at night? It should have its flowers open at night. All right, so here are our key ideas. First set of key ideas for today. Pause the video, take a minute, and write them down. If you have any questions, a good time to ask. Okay, we're going to move on now and talk about fertilization. So once pollen grains of the right kind, the right species, have landed on the stigma of a flower, what will happen is it's called a pollen tube will grow down the style. So the pollen tube is kind of similar to a fallopian tube. It's a connection between the pollen and the ovules, the bottom. It's going to allow the sperm to transfer to the ovules and will then fertilize the ovules or the eggs, and they'll become a zygote, just like how it happens in humans. Sexual reproduction, same kind of way. The zygote then develops into an embryo, and that embryo is encased in a seed. If it's a full angiosperm, it will then also become part of a fruit. So angiosperms have both fruit and flowers, and we'll talk about the importance of fruit later on for dispersal. And some other plants that don't produce fruit would just produce a seed, like cone-bearing plants we talked about earlier. This is a good diagram to show that whole process. So we have pollen being transferred, and the pollen tube grows down the style, and then we're going to have fertilizing the eggs, and then we have a zygote being produced, and that zygote develops into an embryo within a seed over time. So this is a nice diagram of the entire process here. Okay, let's talk about seed structures. So here are 3 different seeds to look at, and the structures you need to know and draw according to IB are the testa, cotyledons, the micropyle, which is a scar from pollen tube opening, as well as embryonic shoots and roots. Now the testa is also sometimes called the seed coat, and this is designed to protect the seed until it's ready to germinate. Now what might a seed need protection from? What could possibly cause damage to a seed? Well, you could have predators eating it. You could have sun, wind, heat, cold. All those environmental factors can affect it as well. Cotyledons, they are seed leaves, and they're going to be used for nutrient storage. So they give the seeds some nutrients inside the seed. Why do seeds need to have nutrients and energy? Well, oops, sorry, went too far. They need to have seeds and energy because when they're first starting to grow, they don't have leaves, so they can't do photosynthesis, which means they're unable to get any energy to grow their first stem, their first leaves, their first roots, and so they have to start with energy from their parents to kind of take them off in life. Okay, this diagram next is showing how seed formation happens and the hormones that cause it in maize. It's a good practice look at looking at data and graphs to better develop those skills for paper 2 questions. So if you look at this here, we can see DAP are days after pollination. Okay, and we can see 3 different graphs here, right, showing different development over time and a nice key here. So take a little bit of time and look at this and try to figure it out. The hormones are here. We have OX. You guys should know OX or auxins, and you can talk about ABA as well for development. So just read this over and just practice interpreting these kinds of diagrams and noticing all the details. That's why this is here. Okay, next thing is you have to be able to draw the internal structures of seeds. So you can pick any of these seeds to draw. The pine seed cross section. This is a seed here as well, and here's a nice backlit diagram of a seed. You need to draw the seed and label the structures of the seed. So again, pause the video, take a minute, and give it a drawing. Okay. Next thing here, we're going to talk about after the seeds are formed. So once a seed is formed, it has to be dehydrated so it can become dormant with the right conditions to germinate. So we want to have the right light, the right pH, the right temperature, right amount of moisture, all those things to germinate a seed. Once a seed is fully formed, it needs to be dispersed. So dispersal means sending the seed to a new environment, a new place. Why is that necessary? Why do seeds require dispersal? Well, dispersal is about getting an environment that is going to be hopefully away, far enough away from its parent plant that it's not going to compete with its parent plant for resources. We want to avoid that competition and be able to just thrive without taking nutrients and energy from the parents. Now, seeds have evolved various ways to disperse themselves, and these all cost the plant energy. So, why is a plant spending energy making these kinds of structures to allow the seeds to disperse, like making little hooks to have them hook onto animal fur or socks, wind dispersal, things like on a dandelion, or fruit that cause a bird to eat them and then poop the seeds out inside the fruit in a new place? Why is that worth the energy? Well, in terms of reproduction, if the seeds are able to land in a place that has more nutrients and less competition, they'll be more successful and then pass on those traits to the next generation. So evolutionarily, anything that's going to affect the success of the next generation to reproduce is going to be an advantage. And increased seed dispersal is definitely an advantage for that reason. Okay, here are some different seed dispersal methods. So we have seeds dispersed by wind, so like milkweed, dandelions, and maples. These all disperse in the wind. They have structures to help them stay in the wind longer when they start to fall off the plant. Animals, we have ticks, sandbirds, blackbirds. They'll stick to the fur of animals or the clothing of humans. We have ones that will float in water. Coconuts are actually seeds. They'll float in water to a new island and hopefully be able to grow. Cattails, lotuses are all seeds that float. We have seeds that burst and pop open, um, like witch hazel, jewelweed, and violets, that their seeds fly a little further away and just fall straight down. They kind of fly out a little bit. And then humans, we disperse seeds by eating things and by spitting them out. I know people like my mom loves to eat cherries in summertime, and she'll just spit the seeds in the backyard over, and sometimes cherry plants just pop up the next year. It happens. So how could we describe this in terms of evolution? Think back to the 4 principles of natural selection and talk through an example. For an example, you should be thinking about talking about the dispersal in terms of variation, modification, adaptation, and overproduction. Connect all these topics, guys, the IB exam approaches. Okay, here is an example for you, and cue my dog to bark. So if you don't know, my dog's name is Kuga, and here is she's in the lesson talking about her and the purple flowers. So these purple flowers are very often found in my dog's tail, and they drive me slightly crazy because they are everywhere in her tail and in her fur, and I have to pull them out. So they stick to her tail, and this is an example of seed dispersal. How is that an example? Of course she's barking right now. That's so funny. Sorry, guys. So seed dispersal is happening. The seeds are getting stuck in her fur, and not just her fur, but any organism. They get stuck in my clothes too if I walk too close to bushes. And what happens is these are actually the seed pods. So she would take them to a new place, and either would fall out by themselves, or in the case she's my pet, I would pull them out of her hair and then chuck them on the ground or in the garbage or whatever, their compost. So they're going to end up in a new place away from their parent plant without having to do anything themselves. And what would you say this is coevolution? And this is not coevolution simply because these are not only dispersed by dogs. These are dispersed by anything that has fur or something that they can stick to. Hair, when I've been gardening before, I've got some stuck in my hair. I'm sure you guys have too if you have these plants around your homes. They're very, very sticky, and they seem to bloom all year round in Morocco. So they're definitely a great example of seed dispersal. Okay, key ideas number 3. All right, we're going to stop there for today, guys. Continue after.